Good morning and welcome to the live series Straight Off the Bat. Join us on Thursdays as we speak to individuals across multiple industries who will help you understand financial literacy and education. If you're joining us from Facebook, thank you so much. Don't forget to like and follow our page to continue seeing content that will help you manage your money. Today, we're discussing how digital banking helps caregivers of seniors in Trinidad and Tobago with Nicole-Anna de Silva. Nicole-Anna is an attorney at law and an ACC qualified accountant. She's actually one of our most attended live shows as well. Apparently, she's very popular, so I think you want to stick around for this. She's been practicing law for over a decade and is presently the chairperson of the legal committee of the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago. She also advises RBC on legal issues throughout the Caribbean arising in the retail, business, corporate banking lines of business. She loves spending time with her family and traveling to different countries and learning new skills. So today we welcome Nicole-Anna. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Pauline. It is my absolute pleasure to be back again. And hello to everyone joining in and tuning in.
Yeah, last time we were here, we were discussing power of attorney, and that got so many hits, conversations, viewers, questions, because that really hit home in terms of people's dynamic, family dynamic, and what they can learn. But today, for us to just kind of go back in terms of what is a caregiver? You there?
I am here. So I really found this topic particularly interesting, following from our last topic in relation to elder abuse and powers of attorney. And to be honest, I was wondering, how can I really reach the audience in terms of the importance of digital banking in the context of a caregiver? So, in this context, I would like to apply a very broad definition of a caregiver. Usually, we would associate a caregiver with someone who is employed to give care to an elderly person, but I don't think that that definition serves us well in this context. I think in this context, we should consider caregivers as all persons who provide care to an elderly person. So it could be family members, it could be hired persons, it could be trained persons and untrained persons. And in that regard, it really is very impactful when you consider how digital banking can assist an elderly person as well as the caregiver for an elderly person. So I'm hopeful that we can adopt that very broad definition and take into account what exactly a caregiver's role may be in terms of an elderly person's financial affairs. So in that instance, and having that in mind, I would say that a caregiver may have a limited role in relation to an elderly person's financial affairs once they are duly appointed to act on that person's behalf, on the elderly person's behalf. So when I say duly appointed to act on the elderly person's behalf, it takes us back to our previous conversation, which focused on the use of powers of attorney to appoint one person to act on behalf of another person, and the power of attorney being a legal instrument outlining what are the actions and transactions that person can do on the person who gives the authority, so we'll call them the donor, who the donee would be the person appointed or the representative. So what actions the representative can do on behalf of the person who would have provided them with the authority. So if a caregiver has a power of attorney, or a power of attorney was granted by the elderly person to a caregiver, the bank would take that into account in terms of transactions being undertaken on the elderly person's behalf. If there is no legal instrument, whether it is a court order, and we'll go into the court order aspect in a few minutes, or a power of attorney, which is what we are discussing now, if neither of these exist, which appoint the caregiver to act on behalf of the elderly person, the bank will be a little hesitant, actually, I could say very hesitant, to allow a caregiver to conduct transactions or do any actions on behalf of the elderly person. And this is all within the context of ensuring that we act on behalf of our client and in our client's best interests. And I'm going to take us back to my first statement, where I would have indicated, I was trying to consider this topic, how to reach the audience, how to highlight the importance of there needed, there needs to be legal authority for a caregiver to act on behalf of an elderly person before they even transact on the elderly person's behalf. It is important that that is properly documented. So one form of documenting this legal authority would be the power of attorney. Another form of documenting this authority would be via court order. And particularly this comes into, our domain when the elderly person is mentally incapable. So when the bank receives any information that an elderly client may be mentally incapable, we will not act on behalf of that client unless we receive a court order appointing someone to act on behalf of that client. And we would only act on the instructions of the person appointed under the court order. And I think that is very important that we all have to take into account when we consider caregivers and their role in terms of assisting elderly persons in conducting financial transaction, in doing certain actions involving the bank, and in having regard to the fact that the bank has the elderly client as a client, and a caregiver who may be hired to take care of the elderly person would have the elderly person as a client, and they also have the elderly person's interest at hand. But from the bank's perspective, we are interested in getting instructions from our client or a person legally appointed to act on our client's behalf. So I think it's quintessential. We start there, particularly in the context of this discussion, how digital banking can help caregivers. So in the context of digital banking, of course, we want to reinforce that caregivers are not permitted to act on behalf of the client through digital means if they are not legally entitled to do so. So that is something that I think that we should all take away from this discussion, the importance of being legally appointed to act on behalf of the elderly person. And we taking into account caregiver is a very broad definition that we're adopting. We're not adopting the focused definition of persons employed to give care to an elderly person, but we're giving a broad definition. Just persons who provide care, whether it is a family member, a neighbor, a licensed nurse. It's all of these persons, a licensed medical professional, all of these persons fall within our definition of caregiver, at least in the context of this discussion. So I have rambled on, but I just wanted to make sure that we had this pretty clear as our introductory piece, that we're dealing with legally appointed caregivers acting on behalf of elderly persons. So I'm going to also go on.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I realize I'm rambling on, but as I had mentioned in our last session, I am so passionate about ensuring that the elderly's interests are highlighted and really taken care of in the context of banking, that you would find me rambling on. So please,
that's okay.
stop me whenever.
That's why we invited you here. So there's a lot of terminologies that you just shared, and I want to just kind of you may have to repeat yourself a bit because we have a lot of people who are coming in after we went live. So if you're just joining us, you can head over to the comment section to reference the links that we discussed, the power of attorney and elder financial abuse. You can watch that after this though, because we want to get the Q&As later on if possible. So when we think about caregivers, a lot of people assign it to a retirement home. But in the context of this conversation and the access to funds in terms of digital banking, you're saying to us, hey, a caregiver is a broad term that does not automatically assign someone to access the funds of somebody else. So for just let's take a quick sort of difference into what a caregiver, because you mentioned a licensed medical profession, which I would assign to a retirement home or someone visiting someone at their home to take care of them. So for the purpose of this discussion, a caregiver covers all those things, whereas a power of attorney has access to funds.
So in the context of this discussion, the caregiver covers all persons who provide care to the elderly person, and a power of attorney would be a legal instrument which appoints a specific person to do certain acts on behalf of, and in this instance, an elderly person. So from the previous discussion, we would have gone through the power of attorney being a legal document that has legal requirements under laws of Trinidad and Tobago, to which people use from time to time to appoint someone to act on their behalf. So you would, if you are going abroad or you are unable to come physically into the branch, or you just want to appoint someone to act on your behalf for certain circumstances, or generally, you can execute a power of attorney and have it duly registered under the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. And that person would be appointed to act on your behalf as the elderly person. But what I think is important for a caregiver who is appointed under the power of attorney to note, as well as bankers in general, is that our client does not change. Our client remains the elderly client. So even if our elderly client appoints someone as who is their caregiver via a power of attorney to do certain transactions on their behalf or to act on their behalf generally, what is important for all persons to note is that our client remains the elderly person. So we may from time to time, we meaning the bank, may from time to time refer to our client, who is the elderly person, to verify instructions, particularly where we see the instructions may be to the detriment of our client. And when I say instructions, those instructions may be coming from the caregiver who is appointed via the power of attorney to act on our client's behalf, almost in an agent capacity. Let's say it like that. There are differences, but let's say it like that for the purposes of this discussion. So in that capacity, we may receive instructions from a caregiver saying, please transfer $10,000 from the elderly client's account into my personal account. As a bank, we may take the view that it is important, or as the banking members of the banking industry, because we are on straight off the bat. As members of the banking industry, we may take the view that that instruction is to the detriment of our client, and we require our client to verify those instructions. And in that instance, you may find members of the banking industry reaching out directly to their client, who would be the elderly person, to verify the instructions received from the caregiver appointed via power of attorney. So there are terms that I'm using, and I recognize that they're coming from left and right, and we are talking about different legal instruments and legal definitions. But I think what I would love for the audience to take away from this is that the relationship between the bank and its client, the elderly person, does not change as a result of the appointment of a caregiver to act on behalf of the elderly person. The bank remains contractually obligated to act in the best interests of its client, which is the elderly person. So I do want us to keep that very clear in the minds of our audience as we pursue this discussion, because it is a very important discussion. You would find yourself as as a child giving care to an elderly parent, wanting to ask questions of the bank about your elderly parents' financial affairs. But if you are not legally entitled to that information, if you're not legally appointed to act on behalf of your elderly parent, the bank is constrained. We as much as we would love to help in each instance, we have to keep in our minds that we have legal duties and responsibilities to our client, the elderly person, who may be your father, who may be your mother, who may be your charge as a caregiver, but we as members of the banking industry, we have obligations to our clients, and we have to keep that in mind when responding to queries, when responding to requests for certain transactions. So it's important in terms of making sure that we act on behalf of the client in a proper legal manner. So that must be clear when approaching members of the banking industry.
Yeah, and we covered this a little bit earlier, but we would definitely have to reiterate the fact that those conversations have to be had with your parents, because we do grow up in a culture where it's, taboo to have these discussions, but you just never know what tomorrow is going to bring, if not today. So basically, it is important for you to, as a child of parents, the parents watching, these are the conversations that you need to assign power of attorney for your funds. So for the purpose of this discussion, we want to talk about some financial responsibilities that caregivers may have and how does digital banking fit in. But we're going to cover that right after the break. And welcome back to Straight Off the Bat, a live series that covers financial literacy and education. If you're joining us from YouTube, thank you so much. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button and follow our page to continue seeing content that will help you manage your money. Today, we're discussing how digital banking helps caregivers for seniors in Trinidad and Tobago with Nicole-Anna de Silva. So we're going to bring her back in because this is such a robust conversation that requires a lot of information. And when it comes to the legal system, a lot of us don't understand. Some of us even read the laws and still don't understand. So we're going to try and, pull as much information from Nicole-Anna as possible. So we were discussing caregivers, power of attorney, but when it comes to caregivers, it's such a broad term, in terms of it could be someone looking after someone at their home, it could be a licensed medical profession, folks within a retirement home. But within that caregiver's responsibility, there comes some financial elements. What are some of the expectations when it comes to managing finances from a caregiver perspective?
That's an excellent question, Pauline. And I'm taking that question in the context of how digital banking can assist in terms of the financial responsibilities placed on both elderly persons as well as caregivers. So if we take into account caregivers who are employed in the homes of elderly persons and who the elderly person may him or herself be making payments to the caregivers. Now we have found previously, a lot of these payments may have been done via cash. So you would have paid, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, give that payment via cash, or go into the bank and create a standing order into the caregiver's account, maybe another option that may be employed. However, in the context of digital banking, I think that it's an opportune time, particularly as we have the relaxation of some of the COVID-19 restrictions, as we see more movement happening throughout Trinidad and Tobago. I think it is an opportune time for elderly persons as well as caregivers to consider the use of digital banking for payments for services. So I will take it from a personal perspective. When I had to utilize the services of a caregiver for my family's needs, what my experience was is that all payments were made via digital banking. And what was the benefit of that, particularly in terms of record keeping, is that I am able to identify when certain payments were made for the fees, for the caregivers that I would have utilized. And it helps, particularly in the instance, which is not my instance, but in other instances where you are using a caregiver for an elderly person, where there may be a contention in terms of whether fees were paid or not, whether there was an issue where the cash may have been withdrawn from a bank account but not received by the caregiver, where there's security issues from the caregiver's perspective, walking around with, a lot of cash and not being able to make it directly to the bank, whether it is using the ATM to deposit the cash or going over the counter to be able to deposit the cash into a bank account. This session really aims to highlight the ease in which these payments could be made, whether it's from the elderly person's point of view, persons in charge of the elderly person's financial affairs, paying caregivers who are employed to assist the elderly person. I think because we have these facilities now from all the different member banks of Batt, we want to take the opportunity to encourage persons who are using caregivers to provide services of care to use digital banking as opposed to using cash, where you don't have the form of record, you don't have the same level of security in terms of persons not having to walk around with cash in hand. It is an excellent alternative in this day and age to make these payments. So that is the focus that I would want us to kind of zero in on in terms of highlighting how caregivers, as well as how elderly persons can take advantage of the digital channels in order to access care and to pay for care.
So I actually have an example that I think your advice would be required on this one, because I know someone who was taking care of someone who has Alzheimer's, which is a very difficult disease, and the children of this person lives abroad. So they were completely managing the individual, their mother, and had to go actually pay for certain things. So what I found usually happens is there's this verbal trust that happens between the caregivers and the power of attorney. But what advice would you have for those caregivers who, just want to get the job done, but doesn't necessarily have that level of, I guess, backing, or to say, okay, this is what I've signed up for and I'm going to get my money back?
In that instance, well, you've raised an important point, particularly in relation to Alzheimer's, because it returns us to the question as to whether the elderly person is mentally capable to handle their financial affairs. And if there are any questions in relation to that, certainly in that instance, there would be a request, particularly from a banking perspective, to receive evidence confirming that the person is able to handle their financial affairs, and usually that evidence may take the form of a medical certificate from a doctor confirming that the person is medically capable of handling their financial affairs. And this is the first step that will be undertaken before any access is given to the elderly person's finances. So I'm just putting that out there in the context of your example. In the event that we're speaking about the elderly person's bank account or accessing the elderly person's bank account in terms of paying for certain things, if we put that aside, or if we take the view that the person is mentally capable of handling their financial affairs and we receive evidence to support this, the next question would be, when the children are abroad, whether it is the children's funds that are being used to pay for certain things, or whether it is the elderly person's funds being used to pay for these things. So that question has to be answered in the context of providing advice. But I am going to make certain assumptions. So my assumption would be that it is the children's funds being used to pay for the elderly person's care or the certain services that need to be provided, that the caregiver is now being asked to, assist in terms of making the payments. And in that instance, if a caregiver is being asked to assist to do things along those lines, it also brings to light the ease with which digital banking can be used. Because if we have children who are abroad with access to funds, access to a bank account, and access to digital banking, who can use digital banking to send funds to the caregiver to do certain transactions on behalf of their parent, it makes life so much easier. You have the transaction record from the children's perspective that they would have sent funds to the caregiver. The caregiver also has the record once they have the digital banking application, or even they have the transaction record on their account, that these funds were placed in their account in order to be able to do certain transactions on behalf of the elderly person. There's no need in that instance to access the funds of the elderly person. It eliminates the inconvenience, which is, I think, what you were trying to highlight, the inconvenience of the caregiver utilizing their personal funds to do certain transactions on behalf of the elderly person. And to me, in that instance, there's a win-win, which we may not have had readily accessed prior to COVID. I think during the COVID period, we saw a lot of more people coming into the fold of digital banking and access to funds, access to information on accounts digitally. And we want to continue that momentum, even though we have an ease of the restrictions related to COVID. We want to continue that momentum. So that is a win-win situation between the children who are abroad and the caregiver who is in Trinidad. There's also the option for the caregiver to also issue receipts. So when the children abroad would ask for certain transactions to be assistance, essentially, from caregivers to conduct certain transactions, I think it is important for both sides for records to be maintained. From the caregiver's perspective, writing down which date this transaction was requested, when the funds were received from the children abroad, as well as retaining and keeping the receipts for any items purchased on behalf of the elderly person. And we have access, a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us have access to camera phones as well as WhatsApp. So taking a picture of the receipt, sending that information back to the children abroad, it is important to have that type of record keeping generally. This is apart from digital banking, this is apart from the core conversation, but certainly it's important to have that type of record keeping generally. So in instances where there may be discrepancies, there may be disputes, there may be just a need to clarify certain things, at least there's a record of the transactions that would have been requested and when they would have been completed, as well as the receipts to verify that the transactions would have happened. So that would be my general advice, again, based on the assumption that we're not utilizing the elderly person's funds. We are utilizing the funds of the children abroad, and the caregiver in Trinidad is able to, facilitate the requests of the children abroad.
That is some great advice, and we're going to actually have version 1 and version 2. And I think the conversation around collecting pension, which is something that a lot of people, there's a lot of controversy around that conversation, and I think we really need to have a look at it in the context of digital banking, but we'll do that right after the break. Welcome back to the live series Straight Off the Bat. If you're joining us from LinkedIn, smash that follow button and don't forget to like what you're seeing and continue seeing content that'll help you manage your money. Today, we're discussing how digital banking helps caregivers for seniors in Trinidad and Tobago with Nicole-Anna de Silva. Now, Nicole is an attorney in law and an ACCA qualified accountant. And I think within those two fields, money and the legal system is something a lot of us just don't know how to navigate. So we're going to bring back Nicole-Anna, and we're going to have this discussion as it relates to the benefit of digital banking when it comes to the collection of pension. And pension is it's just fraught with controversy when you ever see it in the news. And I think that these are the types of conversations that are difficult, but it's very important to have with individuals, because as you get older, the stubbornness just gets, thicker and thicker. You know who you are. You know who you are. So when it comes to digital banking and pension, in the context of this conversation, how does it fit in with the caregiver services?
I think this is an excellent question. From the context of the access to pension. So some persons access their pension via checks. So you would find that particularly government pensions, maybe you may have persons coming into the bank with checks and encashing their pension checks and being assisted by caregivers coming into the bank when they're encashing their checks. And subsequently, maybe years later, you may hear an elderly client say that they don't have any money. They don't have access to their funds. They don't know where their pension money has been going. And as time goes by, you may not get a full explanation from the elderly client as to how their pension money may have been depleted, how, why particularly, why they would have authorized certain transactions that may not have been in their best interests. The pro and the huge advantage of digital banking, particularly passing your pension money through a bank account, is that you would be able to say, on such and such date, certain transactions would have happened. On such and such time, certain actions would have happened as it relates to my account as an elderly person. And in the context of, a caregiver being joined to an elderly person's account. And I say caregiver in the context of our definition that we would have ascribed before, which is persons who provide care to elderly persons and includes family members. So it is not the norm to see the medical professionals or persons hired to come to a client's home to provide care to be joint on an account. It's not the norm. It's not something that we would usually encounter, while it may be a relationship that may be entered into from the perspective of the client, the elderly client, making the decision to make someone joint once they are mentally capable to do so and mentally capable to handle their financial affairs, they are free to do so. But I would say that is not the norm that we see. So in the context of caregiver, be it also including family members, you may see family members coming in, being joined on accounts where pension checks can pass through. And in that instance, it makes it easier to record what happens with the pension. When you access your pension, just directly encash the pension check, because sometimes you just need the pension check right away. The risk that you take is that you don't have a record of what happens next with your pension. And it may be later down the line that it is discovered that your pension funds may have been misappropriated. And we're not ascribing blame to any caregiver or any particular family member or any person in that regard, but it just may be that may have happened. What in my opinion may lower the risk in relation to that is the passing of the pension through a bank account. I mean, we have all heard instances where elderly persons have really just almost come to a destitute status when you would have known that person working all their life, not being frivolous in terms of their finances and making purchases, and their money is completely depleted. When you don't have records of how your money is being used, it is open to abuse. So I would say it is important to have that money pass through a bank account, pass through some way where it could be recorded so that in the future you can rest assured that my money was not misappropriated. And from a caregiver's perspective, you also would feel assured that my client has their records in order. So I would not find later on or later down the line any blame coming my way in relation to how my client would have utilized their funds. Because really and truly, the caregiver, in terms of an employed caregiver, what you base your services on is on your reputation. Once you have one issue coming to light, you would find, because Trinidad and Tobago, we are a very small society, word spreads, you would find that, it's one red flag in terms of your interaction with an elderly person can really put a stain on your career. So it is important, in my opinion, to ensure that there are proper records in terms of how pension is being managed. And one way to do that is passing it through a bank account.
Yeah, I even just like my personal expenses, it's so much easier for me to be able to manage how I spend money in and out. It really is pretty simple, but because we have so much emotion attached to money, it's difficult to have those conversations. So if you're watching this and you haven't had that conversation, please do it because you just never know. So when it comes to the discussion on caregiver and power of attorney, we mentioned earlier that those are two different things because a caregiver is a broad, it covers someone in a retirement home, a licensed medical profession, maybe a cousin looking after an elderly person, but their power of attorney has the financial decisions, basically that responsibility is on them. So what happens, or maybe give us some tips as to how you can make sure you define that relationship upfront, because a lot of the times it might be something quickly, you didn't expect someone to fall in the bathroom, so now you have this caregiver and you haven't necessarily put things in writing or have an understanding as to what those responsibilities are and where does the financial responsibility start and end. So can you give us maybe two or three tips as to what that relationship should start off with?
Sure. So we're gonna do tips and tricks. Tips and tricks in the context of how to properly define what are the expectations. So from a family perspective, you would find that family members just rise to the occasion and say, I am here to look after auntie, I'm here to look after my father. He or he, being the father, or she being the auntie, would have fallen in the bathroom and couldn't get up and would have broken a hip, and I want to assist in terms of their care. That is a noble cause. That is excellent in terms of stepping up and really being there to bolster vulnerable persons in society. In that action of stepping up, I think it's important, particularly where your father or your daddy or your auntie, they are still mentally capable to handle their financial affairs, to be very clear in terms of what are the expectations that both of you have in terms of what are the actions you would be doing on their behalf. So if that is unclear, it brings a whole host of issues that you may not want to encounter later on. So having the conversations, as you always say, Pauline, is so important. But taking it a step further in terms of documenting the conversation is another step that I would recommend. So documenting it insofar as whether it is writing down, it may be a temporary assistance that you may be giving auntie or daddy. And if you're doing it in a temporary capacity, you'd want to know, what exactly is the assistance that you need. You need assistance getting in and out of bed. You need assistance bathing. But what about your financial obligations? Do you have any loans that you have to pay? Do you have to go to the bank for any reason? Do you have to go to the credit union for any reason? Are you able to physically go to the credit union even though you would have broken your hip? Do we have to make certain arrangements? How should we make those arrangements, documenting those things from the outset? I mean, you would be seeing your father in pain, you will be seeing auntie in pain from time to time, and they may not be in a position to answer all of the questions. At the same time, it may be you alone taking on this charge because the other members of the family may not be available. But it's important to document, particularly when the person who you are taking care of, they have the mental capability to transact on their behalf. It's important that things are clear, there's a defined time period, there's defined actions that you are able to do and what actions you're not able to do and how you can provide assistance. I think in all instances, that needs to be clear. And in most instances, as life evolves, evolves and as time changes, as your needs change, there's a need to go back to that particular, and I would say it's a document, and a document preferably that is signed by both parties. It does not have to be prepared by an attorney at this time if it is just outlining what are the expectations. But certainly it should be a document saying, this is the help that I need, and this is the from auntie or daddy's perspective, and this is the help that I'm going to provide from the relative's perspective. Having that documented, and we can bring it further removed and saying, this is what I need from the elderly person's perspective, and this is what I am able to provide from the caregiver's perspective. Having that properly documented is important. And when there are changes that need to be made to the document, returning to the document from both parties' perspective and saying, I realize that you need a little more help, and it may be bringing it back from the banking industry's perspective, you may need a little more help from a banking perspective in terms of doing banking transactions. What solutions you think we should have?
Thank you so
And
much for. Oh, sorry. I thought you were finished there, but thank you so much for that, because I find what I want to just reiterate is we have a culture of, let's shake on it. It's this side of like and I know people who've been in businesses for years and they don't have contracts. So I mean, I can't stress enough how important it is for us to get these things in writing and to agree things. And by the way, is email considered a legal document?
well, there's a school of thought that an email exchange can form an agreement. So what you're suggesting is the possibility of an elderly person exchanging an email with a caregiver, outlining what are the expectations, and then the caregiver exchanging the email or confirming that the contents of the email would be sufficient. At least having that exchange as a start, I think would be an excellent start to the process, depending on what are the needs of the elderly person as a client. It is a start. My strong suggestion would be to move forward from that start eventually to having a signed document particularly if you are a paid caregiver. If there is value in having a signed document from the elderly person as well as from your perspective, and making accommodation or making provisions to be able to return to that document or return to the email chain and say, if there are any changes that need to be made in terms of the type of care that you need or the type of services that you provide, and you can always come back. And really and truly, from a legal perspective, it would be renegotiating what is the arrangement. But the email is a great start. Having an email exchange where parties confirm that this was the conversation or this is the expectation and this is the agreement is an excellent start as well. And then moving it forward from the email exchange to a more concrete document would be an excellent next step, in my opinion.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much for that. We're going to go on a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to end the session with a conversation on mortality. So we'll be right back. Welcome back to Straight Off the Bat. If you're joining us from Facebook, thank you. Don't forget to like and follow our page to continue seeing content that will help you manage your money. Today, we're discussing how digital banking helps caregivers, Trinidad and Tobago, specifically seniors, with Nicole-Anna de Silva. So, we're going to close off this discussion because caregivers, if you missed it earlier, it's a broad term and not separate and apart to power of attorney. And within this discussion, I hate to give you guys bad news, but none of us are going to live forever. I know you've seen it on TV, you've seen all this technology, but it's Hollywood. Mortality is something that we all have to just it's inevitable. So if that's the case, how are we putting things in place to make sure folks aren't scrambling when you're not around? So when it comes to a senior ward, Nicole-Anna, could you explain what that terminology means and then what happens after with regards to finances?
Well, in the context of a senior ward, it would be an elderly person who is in the care of another person. And in the context of mortality, when that elderly person dies, if, you know, there was a power of attorney that would have been granted by that senior person who has now passed away, that power of attorney would no longer be valid once that person dies. Any authority that would have been passed by that person to any other person during their lifetime would no longer be valid. And what we would be looking for from a banking perspective, from a legal perspective, is that if the person had a will, that the executor or executrix appointed via the will would be would apply to the courts for a grant of probate, or if there's that the appropriate person would apply for letters of administration to really be able to step into the shoes of the deceased elderly person and to be able to transact on their behalf. And mortality is such a, a final topic for us to end with, but it is an important topic because we even at from an early stage in terms of our career, in terms of building a family, building a life, building a legacy, it is important for us to also have wills, also make the proper preparations for when we pass on. And you find that the younger generation would not take into account making a will. The older generation may not take into account making a will, but the fact that a will does not exist really brings into play a lot of different dynamics when a person dies, whether the person is elderly or not. So if we want to take something else from this conversation is the importance of creating a will at any stage and revisiting the will as life happens, because you have the acquisition of a house, you buy a house, you buy a car, you sell a house, you sell a car, and you need to make sure that your will changes as your life changes and as your assets change. And Pauline, I know that you are an avid marathoner and you are doing the most, as the young people say. And even in that context of being healthy and vibrant and carpe diem being your main motto, it is important for us all to take mortality into account and to make the necessary preparations, because it really brings to light when you pass on how many different dynamics happen in terms of what is the legacy that you would have left and how people treat with the legacy that you have left. So it is a dreary topic to end on, but it is an important topic to end on. I'm seeing you now, Pauline. I hope I'm not making you blush.
No, it's okay. I think these straight off the bat live shows have taught me so much. The fact that I get to learn these things and engage with you guys it's been really life changing. And I think that is such an important way for us to end this discussion because we think And I say we because back in my 20s, I'm like, I'm going to live forever. But you're right. You just never know. And I think that we all have to put those things in place. So just give us a quick tip as to anybody who wants to approach this, mortality conversation with their parents. What's the number one thing, opening conversation they should start off with?
The opening conversation that you should start off with is, I want your legacy to be your own. And I would like you to make sure that that happens. And in order to do so, it is important to have a will. Truly, I think that is the most important opening. Having your legacy be your own. If you don't have a will, you're opening up your legacy to the determination of whether it is the legal structure within the legislation or others in terms of how they determine things are to be partitioned. And that's not what you want for your parents. So having that first step, having them create that legacy in writing, following the proper legal requirements, I think it's extremely important to have that type of conversation and open in that way.
Well, thank you so much for that piece of advice. I think that's a great way for us to end. Thanks again to Nicole-Anna de Silva for joining us today and sharing insight into how digital banking helps caregivers in Trinidad and Tobago, specifically seniors. Don't forget to sign up and be notified for the next live show in the comment section, wherever you're looking at this, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And always be sure to follow because you don't want to miss a single live show. Thanks again for joining us. We're actually going to end off today's session with a very, this is such a cool idea and a great series. It's called Ask a Banker. And if you want to learn more about this series, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel because you're going to get to know a lot about your banker. So I'll see you on the next live show. Bye.
Everywhere, I remember my first girlfriend I was wearing that shirt. That was the style. I was slamming. When wear it now, that's when you used to wear big clothes and baggy jeans.
Right.
And I still have that shirt up to today. Hi, my name is Mark, and I am a banker. And this is Ask a Banker Anything with Batt. Doubles or roti, you could only choose one. Doubles all the way. Doubles for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Working in the bank and being privy to the different levels of technology that we have and payment systems, I hardly have cash. I literally never have cash. And the day that a doubles man can have access to digital payments, I will never have cash. I use whether it be cards, debit cards, online payments, online transfers on a regular basis. I cannot remember the last time I stepped into a utility company to pay a bill. Definitely I do everything in either online or digital space. How did you get into banking? Truth be told, purely by accident. I always say I had applied to several different institutions. When I left school, it just so happened that First Citizens, reached out and, I thought I was just going in to do a job, and little did I know that, it would really jumpstart my entire career. If you weren't a banker, what do you think you would be? I know that offhand. If ever I decide to leave banking, I would definitely love to open up my own restaurant and be a chef that specializes in gourmet Creole cuisine. What's the first thing you would do if you checked a bank account and it had $1 billion in it? I would immediately call the branch and find out why that money is there. I am a God-fearing man, and they know that $1 billion would definitely not be mine. The first thing I ever purchased when I got my first paycheck was a blue plaid shirt in Detour stores. I remember watching the shirt for an entire month, and I told myself when I got paid, that is the first thing I'm going to buy. And so did, so done. Why is having a bank account important? For many reasons. For you to really be part of this payment ecosystem, it all starts with for you to apply for a loan to fuel, whether it be a mortgage or a car or or you want to take a loan to do some studies or personal, it starts with a bank account. A bank account is really the first step in cementing that relationship between you and the financial institution. So it really is the foundation for any future transactions or interactions with a bank. Which bank is the easiest to open an account in Trinidad and Tobago? Well, I can say that in First Citizens, you can schedule an appointment online at a branch of your choosing, and although yes, there are a lot of different documentation that we are mandated by to have prepared, we really pride ourselves in being the easiest in terms of account opening. Which is the best bank in Trinidad and Tobago, and why? Well, your answer is in the question. We are the only indigenous bank within Trinidad and Tobago, and First Citizens prides itself on being first in customer service, in our commitment to technology and driving a lot of the technology that will make your day-to-day simpler, easier. It really comes down to our tagline. We really focus on being simple, on being easy, and being fast. And that is First Citizens.